By the time the harbor windows turned black and the last line of sunset disappeared off the water, I had already run through the same numbers in my head so many times they stopped sounding like numbers and started sounding like prayer. Rent in 4 days. After-school care on Friday. Lila's field trip form still sitting on my counter with the payment box unchecked. I was carrying a tray of glasses through a dining room full of men who looked like they had never once had to choose between groceries and gas. And all I could think about was whether I had enough milk left for the morning. That was the thing about fear when you were a single mother. It never arrived by itself. It showed up holding hands with math. The restaurant sat on Baltimore Harbor, glass and dark wood and low amber light. Most nights, and the room belonged to anniversary couples, finance guys, tourists wanting seafood with a view. That night, it belonged to one private party, and from the second I walked in, I could feel the difference. Nobody had raised a voice. Nobody needed to. The host stand had been cleared early. The front windows were half-screened. 2 extra men stood near the entrance in tailored coats that did not quite hide the shape of their shoulders. Another lingered near the hallway leading to the kitchen, never blocking the way, just existing in it. The whole room felt less like a dinner and more like a perimeter pretending to be one. I had learned a long time ago how to make myself smaller in places like that. Not weak, just forgettable. There was a skill to it. Keep moving. Anticipate what people want before they ask. Keep your face neutral. Let them look through you if that helped you get home safe. So I moved and watched. At the center table sat Nico Moretti. I did not know everything about him, and I did not want to. In neighborhoods like mine, men like him were not celebrities. They were weather. You learned the outline because not knowing could cost you. He was younger than I expected, maybe late 30s, in a dark suit, with no wasted motion, the kind of stillness that did not read as calm so much as control. Across from him sat Grant Holloway, one of those clean American men who made expensive manners look effortless. If I had seen him anywhere else, I might have taken him for a donor or a developer. But something about him sat wrong with me almost immediately. He looked relaxed in a room that did not feel safe enough for real relaxation. The seating did not help. The private dining room held 12 comfortably, but only 6 places had been set. 2 on each long side. 1 at each end. Yet the gravity of the room stayed locked at the middle, where Nico and Grant faced each other over white linen and candlelight. Everyone else orbited. Men stood where they could see doors, hallways, reflections in the glass. Nobody drifted casually. Nobody forgot their position. Even my manager noticed it. He pulled me aside before service and told me to keep the table happy, keep the pacing smooth, and not improvise. I kept circling in and out, refilling water, clearing plates, replacing cutlery. The words at the table never came clearly enough to make sense of, only tones. Grant sounded smooth, warm in a way that felt practiced. Nico sounded harder to read. Not cold, exactly, and more like a man who had no need to decorate what he meant. I noticed his hands because service trains you to notice hands. Nico had a habit. Whenever Grant leaned in, Nico's right hand settled near the edge of the table, close to where the cloth fell, like he needed one quiet point of contact while he listened. Once I saw it, I could not stop seeing it. By 8:30, my feet were throbbing inside my shoes, and all I wanted was the end of the shift and my kitchen light, and Lila asleep under the blanket with the faded yellow stars. Ms. Dolores had kept her overnight for me because the event ran late. I was clearing the side of the table between courses when I noticed a tiny fold in the linen near Nico's place setting. Not enough to matter to anyone else. Enough to matter to me. Small things were my job. I crouched. I reached under the hanging edge of the cloth and smoothed it by instinct. My fingers brushed the underside of the table. For 1 second I thought it was condensation, or spilled wine, or polish not fully dried. Then I felt the texture. Not wet exactly. Slick, slightly tacky, almost invisible against the wood. I pulled my hand back and kept my face still. That part happened before thought, before fear, before meaning. When I straightened, nobody at the table had changed expression. Grant was still wearing that easy smile. Nico was still listening with that unreadable focus. But my fingertips had. I turned toward the kitchen with my tray balanced level in my hand, and only when I reached the service station light did I look down. A clear, sticky sheen caught across the pads of my fingers, and before I could explain why, something inside me went cold. Under the kitchen light, the residue looked almost innocent. That was what made my stomach drop. It shone across my fingertips like the kind of thing a tired waitress might mistake for furniture polish or spilled syrup if she was moving too fast to care. Clear, slightly tacky, easy to wipe away, easy to miss, easy to die from, if the wrong memory was already living inside you. Mine was. Years earlier, my brother Noah had taken a dock cleanup job because rent was due, and pride had never paid a bill in our family. A container had leaked near one of the older shipping lanes, and the men who hired the crew had treated the whole thing like inconvenience instead of danger. Noah came home talking about a strange gel on a rusted surface, how it had clung to his gloves and somehow gotten onto his skin anyway. He laughed about it that first night, said he was fine. 4 days later, he was in a hospital bed with monitors clipped to his chest and our mother gripping the rail hard enough to turn her knuckles white. What scared me most was not how sick he got. It was how quietly it happened. No dramatic collapse, no obvious warning. Just a tiredness that kept deepening, nausea that would not let up. Doctors moving faster after hours of acting like maybe it was a virus, maybe dehydration, maybe stress. By the time somebody asked the right questions about where he had worked and what he might have touched, the damage was already inside him doing what damage does best when it wants to stay hidden. Our family learned a terrible vocabulary that week. Absorption, delayed onset, exposure window, organ stress. We learned that some chemicals did not burn or stain or announce themselves. They entered a body quietly, the way bad news enters a life. By the time fear arrives, it is already late. I stood at the service station with my hand held away from my apron, and knew that what I had touched under Nico Moretti's side of the table did not belong there. Maybe it was not the exact same compound, but it was something meant to work through skin, meant to stay unseen, meant to leave confusion behind instead of proof. I rinsed my fingers once, then again. When I looked back through the kitchen door, the dining room no longer felt tense in a vague way. It felt arranged, and not by chance. Nico at the center, Grant facing him with that polished ease. The men near the entrance standing where they could contain movement without appearing to. One near the kitchen corridor, close enough to intercept staff, far enough to look incidental. Even the table itself now looked chosen. That was the moment the fear changed shape. Until then, it had been fear for him, or maybe fear of whatever kind of men would do something like that during dinner. But once the pattern locked into place, I understood something worse. If Nico had touched that table all night, if he had gone home feeling fine and collapsed tomorrow, nobody like Grant Holloway would be the first one questioned. The police would start where they always started, with staff. With the people who carried plates, poured wine, touched tablecloths, cleared glasses. People with hourly wages and no lawyers. People like me. I thought about saying nothing. I want that to be part of the truth. I thought about finishing my shift, on going home to my daughter and pretending I had not recognized what I recognized. I thought about Lila's hair tangled across her pillow. I thought about school lunch money. I thought about Ethan and the way one wrong story attached to my name could become a weapon in his hands. Silence would not have made me proud, but it might have kept me alive. Then I looked back into that room and realized silence would not keep anyone like me safe for long. If Nico Moretti died, the story would be written before the body even cooled. A private dinner, a waterfront restaurant, service staff in and out all evening. Somebody must have seen something. Somebody must have touched something. Somebody must have helped. And I had. Not by choice. Not knowingly. But my fingerprints were already inside the night. My manager was reaching for a bottle of red near the bar when I stepped in and took it first. I steadied the bottle in my hand and felt the weight of it settle me. A reason to approach. A reason to lean in. A reason to stand close without looking strange. My pulse was loud enough to make the room feel distant. I told myself to walk normally. Not fast. Not slow. I pushed through the door with the bottle balanced against my palm, and my face arranged into the same tired, forgettable calm I had worn all evening. Then I started back toward Nico Moretti's table, carrying the kind of warning that could ruin my life if I got it wrong. I pushed back through the kitchen door with the wine bottle balanced against my palm, and every muscle in my body working too hard to look ordinary. The dining room had not changed in the few seconds I had been gone, and somehow that made it worse. Candlelight still trembled in the glasses. Grant Holloway still looked polished enough to belong in a magazine. Nico Moretti still sat at the center of the room with one hand near the edge of the table, close to the place where danger waited. I moved toward them at the same pace I had used all night. Not rushed. Not hesitant. My heart was beating so hard I thought somebody would hear it over the clink of glass. The closer I got, the more carefully I saw everything. Grant leaned back like a man enjoying himself. One of his men stood near the window, looking at nothing and everything. Nico's shoulders were loose, but not careless. I stopped at his right side and tipped the bottle slightly, creating the kind of pause that belonged to service. My hand stayed steady because it had to. I bent just enough to place my face near his shoulder, as if I were checking whether he wanted more wine, and I let the warning leave me in the smallest possible way. I gave him all I had in one breath. Look beneath the table, and whatever you do, do not touch it. Then I straightened and moved on. That was the part that felt impossible afterward. Not the warning itself, but the walking away. I had done something that could get me killed, and then I had to cross the room like I was thinking about nothing more serious than dessert service. I refilled a water glass near the far wall. I adjusted a fork that did not need adjusting. I did not dare look directly at Nico for several seconds. I watched the room the way frightened people do when they are pretending not to watch. Reflections in the window, the shine of stemware, the angle of shoulders, the line of Grant's smile. Time changed shape. Then Nico moved. He let his napkins slide from his lap to the floor in a way so casual I almost thought I had imagined it. He bent to retrieve it, disappearing beneath the edge of the table for no more than a moment. When he came back up, his face had not changed by a fraction. He looked the way he had looked before, composed and mildly attentive, as if nothing in the room had shifted at all. But his right hand never touched the table again. That was when the air changed. Nico reached for his glass with his left hand. He leaned back instead of forward. When Grant seemed to invite emphasis, Nico folded both hands loosely together, instead of resting one near the table's edge. Grant noticed almost immediately. His smile stayed where it was, but it went thinner, harder. I saw his eyes flick once toward Nico's hand, then toward the tablecloth, then toward the men around the room. It was the fastest break in composure I had ever seen. Nico did not rush. That was the terrifying part. He did not accuse anyone or turn the room into a scene. He simply let stillness do the work for him. One of his men, a dark-haired man I had barely registered all evening, stepped closer when Nico gave him the smallest signal. Not a nod, just a shift. Permission. The man came to Nico's side with a folded white cloth and reached carefully beneath the table. Nobody in the room breathed the same after that. When he pulled the cloth back, there was almost nothing to see. A faint, clear smear, barely enough to count as evidence. Yet the silence that followed it felt heavier than shouting could have. Grant's expression held for one more second, maybe two. Then something behind it faltered. His posture stayed controlled, but his confidence no longer fit him the same way. More men entered after that, though quietly. No dramatic rush, no overturned chairs. The whole room seemed to narrow around Grant without anybody needing to explain why. He started to rise and then stopped. Either way, his evening was over before the words caught up to it. I kept moving because I did not know what else to do. My tray felt too light in my hands. My knees had started shaking, but only from the inside. My manager appeared with the stunned face of a man who knew something terrible had happened without understanding what. He signaled for us to clear nothing, touch nothing, ask nothing. Eventually, Grant was escorted out through the side corridor with the same polished quiet the night had worn from the beginning. That was what stayed with me. Not violence. Precision. Only after the room began to empty did my body remember it belonged to me. My mouth had gone dry. My fingers felt numb. I had just set down the unused wine bottle at the service station when one of Nico's men stepped into my path. He did not block me roughly. He simply stood there and turned his attention toward the staircase above the dining room. I understood him before he had to say much of anything. Nico Moretti wanted to see me upstairs, and I followed him upstairs on legs that no longer felt fully attached to me. The staircase rose from the back of the dining room, narrow and quiet. Downstairs, the air still held candle smoke, expensive wine, and the silence that gathers after something important has already gone wrong. Upstairs, the noise fell away. I could still feel the room beneath me, all its tension and rearranged power, but up there everything narrowed into privacy. I had expected something theatrical. Instead, the room looked used. A coat hung over the back of a chair. Papers lay open on a side table. A half-drunk glass of water sat near the window overlooking the harbor. The place did not feel staged. It felt inhabited. Nico Moretti stood near the window when I entered. He turned when the door closed, and I was close enough to see that his control was not the same thing as ease. He looked at me with a level attention that made me feel less like I had been summoned, and more like I had become a problem he intended to understand. He wanted to know how I knew. There was no point pretending otherwise. So I told him about Noah. Not every detail, but enough. I told him about my brother taking dock work because we needed the money, about the leak nobody respected until a body started failing, about the hospital room and the terrible lesson my family learned too late. I told him that some substances do not announce themselves. They move in quietly and let panic arrive after the damage has already begun. Saying it there, in that office, felt different than remembering it alone. The memory no longer belonged only to my family. It had become the reason he was still alive. I also admitted the part that made me ashamed. I told him I had hesitated, not because I doubted what I had touched. I hesitated because I am a mother before I am anything else, and women like me do not survive by stepping between powerful men and their enemies. We survive by reading danger early and keeping our names out of it. I had thought about my daughter. I had thought about rent, custody, school pickup, and all the ordinary things that can be destroyed by one wrong story attached to a woman's name. Then I told him what made me move anyway. If he had died after that dinner, it would not have been men like Grant Holloway left to answer first. It would have been the servers, the kitchen staff, my manager, people whose fingerprints were already on every plate and glass in the room. I had not warned him out of loyalty. I had warned him because if I stayed quiet, the people crushed beneath the aftermath would have looked a lot more like me than like him. He listened without interrupting. Most men hear a woman like me only long enough to decide whether she is useful, emotional, or lying. Nico listened like each word might alter something real. When I finished, the room stayed quiet for a few seconds. Then he made me an offer. Not with charm. Not with pressure. He laid out the kind of future a man like him knows how to build around a threat. Protection, work, a place nearer to his world, where what I had seen and what I knew could be kept within reach instead of left exposed. For one dangerous second, I understood why people say yes to men like him. Not because they are dazzled, because being protected can sound a lot like being allowed to exhale. But I had learned the hard way that gifts from powerful men are rarely just gifts. Even when they are sincere, they arrive attached to a shape, a debt, a change in orbit. And I had a daughter who already deserved more than one unstable man in her life. So I refused. I could not belong to his world. I could not take a job that would pull me closer to danger and call it security. I could not explain that life to Lila, and I could not pretend proximity was the same thing as safety. What I asked for instead was simple. Leave the staff alone. Leave my manager alone. Let the people who work that floor go back to their jobs without fear that the night would stain them afterward. No suspicion. No punishment. No quiet fallout landing where it always lands, and on the people least able to survive it. He agreed so quickly it almost made me distrust him more. Not because he sounded false, because he did not. When I left the office, the dining room below had begun returning to its borrowed normal. Tables were being reset. Candles were being extinguished. By the time I stepped out into the harbor air, I told myself the night was over. I was badly mistaken. I opened my locker before my shift and found an unmarked envelope tucked beneath my apron. Just money. Enough to cover the overdue rent, Lila's school expenses, and the utility bill I had been pretending not to fear. I stood there staring at it with my breath caught halfway in my chest. It felt like relief. It felt like a line being crossed. And worst of all, it felt like both at once. I stood in the employee locker room with the envelope in my hand so long that the fluorescent light above me buzzed like it was impatient. There was no note. No name. Cash. Enough of it to change the shape of my month. That was what scared me. Need has a way of making every moral line look negotiable. On paper, the money was simple. Rent paid, electric bill handled, Lila's field trip covered, after-school care for another 2 weeks. But nothing about it felt simple in my hand. It felt warm even though it had been sitting in a cold metal locker. It felt like relief wearing the clothes of danger. I took it home because I did not know what else to do. My apartment looked the way hard weeks always made it look. Laundry in the chair by the window. A cereal bowl I had rinsed but not fully washed. Now a stack of unopened school papers on the counter next to a grocery list I kept rewriting as if better handwriting might lower the price of eggs. The place was not dirty. It was tired. There is a difference, and women like me know it by heart. Lila was coloring at the table when I came in. She looked up with the kind of trust that can break your heart on a normal day and nearly undo you on a hard one. I kissed the top of her head, set down my bag, and slipped the envelope into the drawer beneath the junk mail, as if hiding it from sight could make it less real. The rest of the evening moved the way motherhood always makes it move. Dinner, bath, purple pajamas instead of the blue ones because the blue ones were apparently scratchy now. Signing a reading log. Checking a permission slip twice just to confirm that yes, the school still wanted money for something by Friday. By the time Lila fell asleep, I was sitting at the kitchen table with the bills spread around me and the envelope placed in the middle like a dare. I hated how quickly my mind started spending it. That was the most honest part. Not fear, not pride. Arithmetic. I could pay the landlord before he taped another reminder to my door. I could stop pretending I had not seen the final notice from the gas company. I could buy Lila the new sneakers she needed, instead of waiting another month and hoping nobody noticed the worn sole peeling near the toe. But money is never just money when it comes from a man powerful enough to place it in your locker without asking whether you would want it there. I did not sleep much that night. The next morning brought the ordinary mercy of routine. Toast cut crooked because I was half awake. Lila asking whether ducks ever got bored of water. Me braiding her hair while mentally calculating tips from the weekend. Life did not pause because my world had tilted. Ethan called that afternoon. He had a gift for sounding responsible whenever it cost him nothing. He could wrap judgment inside concern so neatly that, if you were not the one living with him once upon a time, you might mistake him for thoughtful. Lately, he had been circling back to old themes, stability, structure, whether Lila needed more consistency, whether my work hours were ideal for a growing girl. Men like Ethan never say you are failing outright. They ask questions in a tone that leaves the accusation sitting there on its own. I knew what he was doing. He knew I knew. That was our version of co-parenting. At work, everyone behaved as if the private dinner had become a story too expensive to remember. The table was reset, the glasses polished. My manager kept thanking me for being steady that night without explaining what exactly he thought I had steadied. The dining room looked almost cruel in its normalcy. Same candles, same harbor view, same polished wood. What I could not wash off was the feeling of being noticed. At first it came to me as coincidence. A dark sedan parked across from my building 2 evenings in a row. A delivery problem at the restaurant resolving before my manager even finished complaining about it. A drunk man outside the side alley one night being moved along before he got close enough to bother the closing staff. None of it was dramatic. That was the point. It felt like somebody had extended an invisible roof over my life and expected me to understand without being told. I resented it. I also slept a little better, which made me resent it more. By Thursday, the envelope was gone from the drawer and turned into receipts, paid notices, and one pair of sneakers in Lila's backpack waiting for the weekend. I told myself necessity did not equal surrender. Then Friday came. I arrived early at school pickup because Lila had art club, and Fridays were the day she came out carrying twice as much paper as seemed physically possible. I was halfway across the sidewalk when I saw him. Ethan. He was standing near the fence in a jacket I knew he wore when he wanted to look like a man with his life together. Hands in his pockets, calm posture, not supposed to be there. Not on my day, and not without telling me first. And in that instant, with the sun on the school windows and children's voices spilling toward the sidewalk, I felt something colder than fear settle into me. Whatever had started at the harbor had found the map to my real life. Seeing Ethan outside Lila's school did not feel dramatic. It felt administrative. That was what made it worse. He stood there like he belonged, like fathers waiting at pickup always belonged, like access was the same thing as care. He did not wave. He did not need to. The message had already landed. He knew where to stand to make me feel watched without giving anyone else a reason to notice. By the time Lila came through the doors carrying a paper mask and a backpack full of glitter, I had my face arranged into something calm. That is one of the ugliest skills motherhood gives you. You learn how to smile while your mind is checking every exit. Ethan bent slightly when she reached us, all soft edges and practiced warmth. And for a few minutes he looked exactly like the kind of father strangers would trust. That had always been his advantage. He understood image. He knew how to sound responsible in public and vague in private. He knew how to ask whether I was doing all right in a tone that made it sound as if my answer could be entered into evidence. On the walk to the car, he kept close enough to be inconvenient and far enough to stay deniable. He asked careful questions about my work schedule, whether the late shifts were becoming a pattern, whether I had people around me I trusted. Nothing direct. Nothing a judge would hear as a threat. And just the steady pressure of a man reminding me that he could step into my life whenever it suited him and call it concern. That night, I barely slept. I kept replaying the way he had looked at me, not like an ex making trouble, but like someone testing a lock. At the restaurant, the harbor moved as if none of us mattered. Cargo lights drifted across the water. Deliveries came and went. But now I knew enough to understand that one dinner never stays one dinner when people like Grant Holloway are involved. I started seeing traces of him everywhere. A supplier my manager trusted suddenly stopped answering calls. A temporary hire who had worked the private event was gone without explanation. A dock rumor drifted into the kitchen through one of the prep cooks. Something about paperwork disappearing, and one of Grant's shipping contacts still pushing business through side channels, as if the night with Nico Moretti had only been a delay. That was when the larger truth settled in. Grant had not simply failed, he had survived failure, and men like that do not stop when a plan collapses. They edit, they clean, they circle back. Before I had been scared in the way working women get scared all the time, privately, efficiently, while still packing lunches and showing up on time. Now it became maternal, which is a different species of terror. Maternal fear is humiliating because it makes your imagination cruel. Every street corner becomes a question. Every late bus. Every unknown number on your phone. You do not just picture harm. You picture schedules interrupted, routines mapped, on your child trusting the wrong face because children are supposed to trust the familiar. That was the week Nico's concern stopped feeling abstract. He never called me directly. He never sent anything vulgar enough to look like ownership. What arrived instead was structure. Problems that should have reached me and did not. A broken hallway light in my building replaced before I could complain. A school office clerk telling me that pickup procedures had been reviewed and tightened after an anonymous concern. Protection that moved through ordinary systems until it almost looked accidental. Almost. The man who made that arrangement visible was Marco DeSantis. He met me outside the restaurant one evening under the awning as if bad weather had inconvenienced him personally. He was not rude, which somehow made him harder to like. He looked at me the way some men inspect a weak point in a wall. Useful if reinforced, dangerous if ignored. His tone carried no warmth at all. He did not flatter me for what I had done that night. He made it clear that from his perspective, I was now connected to a problem he had to manage. Marco told me enough to make the ground shift again. Not all of it, but he gave me fragments. Placement charts from the private dinner. Staff assignments. A timeline that showed how carefully the room had been built around Nico's habits and our movements. If Nico had touched that table and died later, the investigation would not have started with Grant. It would have started with us. The servers nearest the table, the hands on the glasses, the staff with access to linens, polish, storage, service routes. Me, Bernard, the kitchen runners. Everybody who could not afford legal protection and did not have powerful friends willing to correct the narrative. The trap had not only been designed to kill a man, it had been designed to leave behind substitutes for blame. I stood there under the awning with the harbor wind cutting through my coat and felt something inside me go cold again. I had saved Nico Moretti from one death. What I had not understood until that moment was that the same plan had quietly prepared the rest of us to carry it too. I could not stop replaying the layout of that room once I understood what it really was. Not a dinner, not even a trap in the simple sense. It was a frame. The table assignment had placed me closest to Nico Moretti's right side, the exact place where his hand kept drifting through the night. The service pattern had kept me circling back within arm's reach often enough to make my presence ordinary. If he had touched that poisoned surface and gone home alive enough to die later, the story would have written itself in the ugliest way possible. A waitress at the center table, a private event, a woman with no money, no influence, and just enough access to look guilty. That was the detail I could not swallow. I had spent days thinking I had stumbled into someone else's war by accident. But the more Marco showed me, the less accidental any of it felt. People like me had not just been present in the blast zone. We had been built into it. He did not dramatize the evidence. He laid it out with the kind of flat precision that made it worse. Temporary staff scheduled in odd patterns. Supplies routed through a vendor nobody at the restaurant usually used. A polished service flow designed to keep certain people close and other people absent. The whole dinner had been arranged so that if the worst happened, suspicion would not climb upward toward power. It would roll downhill, where it always does, toward us. I kept thinking about Bernard, about the line cooks, about the dishwasher who worked 2 jobs and still sent money back to his mother. All of us had been one quiet death away from becoming convenient names in somebody else's report. Then the story widened. Marco did not give me everything at once. Maybe that was Nico's choice. Maybe his. Either way, the information came in fragments. A subcontractor name I half recognized. A dissolved cleanup company tied to one of Grant Holloway's shipping fronts. Internal notes about a chemical family used in marine stripping and industrial surface treatment. Enough to make my skin turn cold before my mind even finished connecting it. Noah. I asked for the paperwork twice because the first time I saw the company name, I thought my eyes were forcing meaning where there was none. But there it was again, buried under layers of subcontracting and legal distance. The same family of compounds that had nearly killed my brother. The same kind of cleanup work. The same disappearing trail afterward, as if paperwork itself had learned how to drown. For years, my family had filed Noah's accident under bad luck, under working-class inevitability, under the private language poor people use when they know they have been wronged but cannot afford to prove it. We had told ourselves he was lucky to survive, lucky the hospital figured it out in time, lucky things were not worse. Now I looked at those names and realized luck had nothing to do with it. What happened to Noah had the same fingerprints all over it as the dinner table. Exposure disguised as accident. Responsibility pushed downward. Records blurred just enough to protect the people at the top. I felt something old and raw rise inside me. Something sharper than fear. Fear makes you smaller. This did the opposite. I got angry. Not clean, righteous anger. Not the kind people applaud in speeches. The ugly kind. The exhausted kind. The kind that comes when you realize pain you spent years domesticating might have been designed by people who assumed you were too tired, too poor, and too busy surviving to ever connect the dots. I thought about my mother sitting in that hospital room pretending not to panic, because panic does not lower medical bills. I thought about Noah going back to work before he was ready because recovery is a luxury when rent is due. I thought about all the ways families like mine are taught to call systemic harm unfortunate and move on. Nico never tried to sell me a version of my own life. That was what unsettled me most. He did not recruit me with sympathy. He did not lean on my anger and tell me where to point it. He simply let the truth remain on the table between us. Names, timelines, patterns. Enough for me to see the machine without pretending he built all of it, or could end all of it by himself. That restraint got under my skin more than force would have. I understood force. Ethan used softer versions of it all the time. Men like Grant built entire careers out of disguising it. But Nico did something stranger. He gave me room. He let me know what he knew, and then left the shape of the choice intact. Being pressured would have been easier. I could have resisted that. I knew how to resist men. What I did not know how to do was stand in front of a dangerous man who was treating my decision like it actually belonged to me. That was when I realized silence had changed meaning. Before, silence felt like protection. Stay small. Stay uninvolved. Get home alive. But once I saw Noah's history tangled into the same network, once I understood that the dinner had been designed to bury people like me under someone else's crime, silence no longer looked like safety. It looked like consent purchased through exhaustion. And I had spent most of my life hoping danger would pass by if I made myself uninteresting enough. Now I knew better. If this machine had already touched my brother, brushed my child's future, and nearly set my name on fire beside Nico Moretti's corpse, then standing at the edge of the story was not neutral. It was surrender. So I made a decision that frightened me for reasons bigger than Nico, bigger than Grant, even bigger than the harbor itself. I decided I was done waiting for powerful people to decide how much of my life they were allowed to take. The decision felt bigger in my body than it did in words. I was not agreeing to help Nico Moretti because I trusted men like him. I was agreeing because I finally understood that refusing to look at danger did not keep it outside my door. It just let it choose the hour it wanted to arrive. If my brother's life had already been brushed by the same machine, if my daughter's safety could be measured by men I had never met, then standing still was not caution anymore. It was surrender dressed up as common sense. So I set rules. I did it the only way I knew how, with my spine straight and my fear hidden inside practical language. Lila stayed out of it, completely. No names near her school, no shadows near her routine, no version of protection that made my daughter part of some private map. My job remained mine for as long as I wanted it. I was not going to become a kept woman in better clothes and call it security. No one at the restaurant got touched because of me, not Bernard, not the kitchen staff, not the runners. And most of all, I was not joining anyone's empire. And I was helping uncover the machine that had already reached into my life. Saying those things inside myself made me realize they were not conditions for Nico. They were promises to the person I needed to remain. He listened the way he always seemed to listen, without interrupting the shape of a thing before it had fully formed. There is something unsettling about a powerful man who does not rush to fill silence, does not smile his way around your boundaries, does not act as if kindness buys him entry. Nico never touched me casually. Not once. Never placed a hand on my arm to soften a request. Never leaned close just because he could. He never used the money from the envelope as leverage either. He did not remind me of it. He did not ask for gratitude. He let my conditions stand there between us like real things. And in a life shaped by men who blurred lines whenever it suited them, that kind of restraint felt almost intimate. Marco, on the other hand, made sure nothing became comfortable. He began using me the way suspicious men use information sources, with careful tasks and cold eyes. Walk me through the room again. Show me where the temporary server stood when the second course landed. Tell me which supply carts were out of place. Which delivery crate looked unfamiliar. Which face belonged to staff and which one only pretended to. He did not phrase any of it gently, and I was grateful for that in a way I did not enjoy. It kept me alert. What surprised him, I think, was how much I remembered. People underestimate working women because they confuse invisibility with ignorance. But serving a room teaches you everything about hierarchy. You learn who is being watched and who is being ignored. You learn which footsteps belong and which ones hesitate. I remembered the extra wine opener that had been moved from the normal station. I remembered a supplier box in the back hall with branding I had never seen before. I remembered one temporary hire holding a tray the wrong way, like someone taught posture for appearances but not for actual service. I remembered how Grant's men placed themselves between Nico and his own natural lines of movement while still pretending to be decorative. By the third time I corrected one of Marco's assumptions, his expression shifted. Not warm, not friendly, just less dismissive. At home, the cost of all of it sat down beside me anyway. Lila sensed things children are never supposed to understand, but almost always do. One night while I was folding her school shirts on the couch, she climbed beside me and leaned her head against my arm. She asked if I was tired or sad. I remember thinking how unfair it was that those were the only two categories available to her, when the truth was far more complicated. I told her I was thinking hard. That seemed to satisfy her. For a few minutes, we sorted socks by color, and she told me a story about a classmate who believed turtles could understand music. That small stretch of ordinary life felt more precious than anything Nico or Marco could have arranged for me. It reminded me what every rule had been built around. For a few days, it even seemed like we might be getting ahead of whatever came next. Then the message arrived. It was not dramatic. No threat scrawled across paper. No shattered window. Just a photograph slipped beneath my apartment door while I was making dinner. Lila at school pickup, caught from across the street. Me reaching for her backpack. Ethan's car half visible in the background. No note was attached because none was needed. By the time I understood what I was holding, the room had already changed. The stove was still on. The noodles were still boiling. Lila was in the next room humming over a coloring book. And in my hands was proof that someone on Grant Holloway's side knew exactly who I was, exactly where to look, and exactly how to make fear feel personal now. The photo stayed in my hand long after the water boiled over. I turned off the stove, moved the pot, checked on Lila, smiled when she looked up, and then went into the bathroom and locked the door like that would somehow keep the image from following me. Me reaching for my daughter's backpack. The school fence behind us. Ethan's car in the frame like a signature somebody wanted me to notice. Nothing in it was dramatic. That was the cruelty. It was specific, calm, and intimate enough to tell me that someone had not just found my name. They had found my life. Fear for yourself is one thing. It is ugly, but it is containable. You can tuck it into your ribs and still make dinner, still answer emails, still get through the day. Fear for your child is different. It does not stay in one place. It crawls into everything. The walk from the parking lot to the school gate. The woman who watches her after class. The route home. The time I spend at work. The 10 ordinary minutes between one safe hand and another. It turns your imagination against you and then punishes you for having one. I stood there in that bathroom feeling rage and shame at the same time. Rage that somebody had looked at my daughter and seen leverage. Shame that I had ever believed I could manage this by staying careful and tired and quiet. Motherhood makes you vulnerable in ways nobody warns you about. Not only because you love someone more than yourself, but because the world knows it. I called Marco first because fear had already made my thinking practical. He picked up on the second ring, and even through the phone I could hear his attention sharpen before I finished explaining. He arrived with another man in less than 20 minutes, checked the hallway, took the photo from my hand, and moved through my apartment with the efficient stillness of someone used to measuring risk faster than panic. What followed happened quickly, but never in a way that made me feel handled. That mattered. Nico did not burst in and take over my life. He sent choices, a temporary apartment under another name, a driver for the next few school runs, additional eyes on Ms. Dolores's building. New pickup instructions filed through the school quietly enough that nobody would think I had become the center of a crisis. In a world full of men who used urgency as permission, he did not. By midnight, Lila and I were in a furnished apartment 3 neighborhoods over with neutral walls, fresh sheets, and the impersonal cleanliness of a place prepared for emergencies. I hated how relieved I felt. I hated that relief had his fingerprints on it. Nico came by once, late, after Marco had already checked the locks twice. He did not stay long. He looked more tired than I had seen him before. Not weak, just worn in a way that made him seem human, and therefore more dangerous to me than ever. People like Ethan exhausted you loudly. Men like Nico carried it in silence. He did not try to comfort me with pretty language. He moved through the apartment, noticed what needed noticing, and made sure I understood what had already been put in place. More than that, he left space. Space for me to say yes or no. Space for me to ask questions without feeling foolish. Space for my fear without using it to step closer than I wanted. Lila woke before dawn and wandered into the living room, dragging her blanket behind her. For one suspended moment, I saw the whole scene from outside myself. The strange apartment, the man in the dark coat standing near the kitchen counter, my daughter blinking sleep out of her eyes. I braced for confusion. Instead, she looked at him the way children look at steady adults, curious, measuring. Then she padded to me, climbed into my lap, and settled there without alarm. Nico did not force warmth. He simply softened his posture and lowered the temperature of the room around him. That was enough. Lila asked if we were having a sleepover adventure. I told myself I would never forgive the world for making that sentence necessary. The next day gave me just enough breathing room to think, and thinking is sometimes its own punishment. Marco returned with a tighter timeline, a printout of calls, year-end financial records that made my skin prickle before I fully understood why. Ethan's name did not appear in some dramatic criminal ledger. That would have been easier. What appeared instead were smaller things. Reimbursements, deposits, payments routed through side accounts connected to a consulting shell one of Grant Holloway's people had used before. At first, I tried to explain it away the way women always do when the truth is too ugly to look at directly. Maybe Ethan had borrowed money. Maybe he had been manipulated. Maybe he had not understood what he was attaching himself to. Then I remembered the timing. His sudden interest in pickup schedules. The careful questions about my shifts. The way he had begun showing up in the exact spaces where access mattered most. He might not have known the whole architecture of Grant's network, but he knew enough to trade information for advantage. Enough to let someone dangerous stand nearer to our daughter's life than he ever should have allowed. That was the moment the worst truth settled in. The threat had not broken into my world from the outside. It had been let in by someone who already knew where the door was. The worst betrayal was not that Ethan had taken money. It was how ordinary it made him. If he had been a monster, I could have filed him away in the part of my mind where monsters live. But Ethan was something harder to survive. He was the father of my child. He knew which cereal Lila liked, which cartoons calmed her down when she was sick, which school door opened first at dismissal. He had not needed to understand the full architecture of Grant Holloway's world to become useful to it. He only needed to believe that his own convenience mattered more than the risk he was creating for us. That was what finally burned the last softness out of me. By then, Marco had the timing, Nico had the pressure point, and I had the one thing none of them could manufacture. A place in the story Grant still thought he controlled. The final meeting was dressed up the way men like him always dress evil when they want it to look respectable. A harbor redevelopment briefing, shipping contracts, cameras, public faces attached to private rot. Grant intended to use the event to stabilize himself after the failed dinner, to make it seem as if nothing serious had shifted around him. Nico intended to let him arrive believing that. I insisted on being there. Not hidden in an apartment. I'm not waiting for the outcome in borrowed safety while men decided which version of my life would survive. This had started with my hands under a table and my voice in the space between fear and action. I was done being moved aside for my own protection by people who thought that was kindness. Nico did not argue the way Ethan would have argued. He did not turn my fear into proof that I should be excluded. He listened, measured the risks, and made room for my choice inside the plan. Marco hated it, which probably meant it was the right decision. The harbor event took place in a glass-fronted conference space overlooking the water. I wore a plain navy dress and the calmest face I could build. Marco positioned me where I could see without becoming obvious too early. Nico arrived separately, immaculate and unreadable. Grant came in smiling. That smile had built half his life. It belonged on campaign mailers and charity boards. Watching him move through the room, greeting investors and city people with polished warmth, I understood something ugly and clean. Danger does not always come looking dangerous. Sometimes it wears excellent shoes and speaks gently enough to make your instincts feel impolite. The unraveling began with paperwork. Not one dramatic reveal. A contract discrepancy. A shell company name. Shipping logs that did not line up with declared routes. Vendor histories tied to dissolved cleanup firms. Records of payments pushed through side accounts. Marco and Nico's people did not storm the room. They tightened it. They let the truth arrive in pieces too solid to laugh away. I watched Grant's expression change the same way I had watched it change at dinner. First annoyance, then concentration, then the hairline fracture in his certainty. He kept trying to recover ground through tone, posture, and the old habit of sounding like the calmest man in the room. But the room had already stopped belonging to him. And then my part came. I stepped forward when it mattered, not as decoration, not as a frightened witness pushed to the edge, but as the woman who had been standing inside his plan before he ever bothered to notice her. I laid out what I had seen that night at the restaurant. The seating, the supplier box, the temporary staff placements, the place where Nico's hand would have rested. The way the service flow had been engineered so that if he died later, suspicion would roll onto people with aprons instead of people with lawyers. I did not raise my voice. I did not need to. Grant looked at me then with something uglier than anger. Recognition. The understanding that the waitress he had mistaken for background had become the witness his whole structure could not absorb. Ethan arrived in the second wave of consequences. He had been brought in under a polite pretense, asked to confirm a financial detail, still telling himself this was manageable. When he saw me, something in him collapsed before any formal accusation did. Because he knew I knew what kind of man he had been willing to become. There was no need for a public scene. The records spoke. The timing spoke. His calls, his deposits, his appearances near school, his sudden curiosity about my schedule, all of it formed the kind of picture that destroys a person more thoroughly than shouting ever could. What broke in Ethan was not just his access. It was his story about himself. He had always wanted to think of himself as flawed, but reasonable. Pressured, but decent. Watching that self-image fail in real time was more satisfying than any punishment I could have invented. He was not a mastermind. He was smaller than that. A man who sold openings into a woman's life because he thought desperation excused him, and because, underneath everything else, he believed he would still be forgiven. He was wrong. By the time the meeting ended, Grant's cover had been punctured from too many sides to repair. Some consequences would happen in rooms I would never enter. Some would happen under fluorescent lights with auditors and investigators. Nico did not need to humiliate him theatrically. He gave him something worse, consequence with documentation attached. When it was over, the harbor looked the same through the glass. Water moving, cargo lights in the distance. Baltimore carrying on without asking what had just been broken inside one room. I stepped outside with my body shaking from the release of holding myself together too long. Nico followed a minute later, not close enough to crowd me, just near enough to make it possible to breathe differently. I realized then that my understanding of danger had changed shape somewhere along the way. The man I had once feared most was now the one person in whose presence I never felt erased. That thought frightened me more than I wanted it to. He did not ask me for gratitude. He did not treat the end of the threat like the beginning of a claim. What he offered instead was harder to hear because of how little it demanded. Space near him, if I wanted it. A safety that did not require surrender. A future that could be approached slowly, in my own language, at my own speed. For the first time in a long time, the next part of my life did not feel like something being decided over my head. It felt like something waiting for my answer. The strangest part of peace is how quiet it is when it finally arrives. For weeks after everything broke open, I kept waking before dawn with the old panic already in my throat. Then one morning, I realized I had been awake almost a full minute without bracing for anything. No dread about school pickup. No fear that Ethan would appear where he did not belong. No tightening in my chest at the thought of work, my name, my daughter, my future. Just a room, soft light, and Lila asleep down the hall. That was when I understood the thing that had changed. It was not that my life had become perfect. It was something simpler. My life had become mine again. Lila was safe. Not in the fragile way safety used to feel, the kind that depended on luck and vigilance. She was safe in the deeper sense. Her routines belonged to her again. Her school days were ordinary. Ms. Dolores walked her home sometimes and complained about her knees and overwatered plants and all the small human things that make a life feel trustworthy. Ethan was still alive somewhere in the city, but he was no longer standing over my life like a question mark. Whatever story he had told himself about being misunderstood had collapsed under the weight of what he had chosen. He no longer had the same access or the same easy assumption that he could step in and redefine reality with the right tone. Losing that mattered more than revenge ever could have. I went back to work because I wanted to, not because I had nowhere else to stand. The restaurant looked the same, and that mattered too. Same polished glasses, same view of the harbor, same tired manager pretending not to be sentimental when he handed me a better shift schedule. But I was different inside it. I no longer felt like background. I no longer felt like the kind of woman danger could pass through and leave unnamed. Nico remained in my life the way the harbor remains in a waterfront city. Present. Quiet. Impossible to forget. He never rushed me toward a future I had not chosen. Some days he was only a call I did not have to make because the thing I needed had already been handled. Some days he was a meal delivered after a long shift, or a driver outside the restaurant on a stormy night because he knew I was tired. The most unsettling thing about him remained what it had always been: his refusal to turn care into ownership. I do not know exactly when fear stopped being the strongest force between us, and trust began taking up more space. Maybe it happened slowly, in all the small moments when he let my boundaries stay mine. Maybe it happened when I realized that being near him did not make me feel trapped. It made me feel considered. One evening, near sunset, I walked down to the harbor after my shift instead of hurrying straight home. The light had gone amber on the water, almost the same shade as it had been that first night. Boats moved slowly in the distance. The wind smelled like salt and metal and cold stone. I stood there and thought about how life changes. Not always with a speech. Not always with some bright, heroic moment you can point to and say there, that was where everything turned. Sometimes it changes in private. In one breath. In one refusal to look away. In one decision made by a frightened woman who still has to get up the next morning and pack a lunch. If there is any lesson in what happened to me, maybe it is this. Courage does not always feel brave when you are inside it. Sometimes it feels quiet. Sometimes it feels sick with fear. Sometimes it looks like a waitress smoothing a tablecloth, a mother opening a school form, a woman deciding that dignity costs less than silence in the long run. And maybe love, if it is real, begins there too. Not with danger, not with being overwhelmed. Maybe it begins the first time you feel safe enough to remain yourself. So tell me this, if you had been me, would you have stayed silent that night? And do you think real love begins with desire or with safety? If this story stayed with you, share it, leave a comment, and let me know.